from 1945 and the end of the war through 1989 and the end of the Cold War, we had a worldview. Republican and Democratic presidents alike, from Harry Truman to George Bush, stood for freedom and stood for certain propositions that would make America strong and healthy and grow the middle class and shrink poverty and stand against communism. And after 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order, and instead it looks like we got a lot of disorder. And we still, and after 9/11, we've been more sensitive to the.
Shalom everybody, it's me, Mr. Tall. I'm back with another video. This is episode 5 in my series, The Guide to the New World Order, which I explain my theory for how the New World Order is laid out. As I've seen through my research, this isn't exactly right, but it's somewhat right. And last episode I talked about the secret societies. I went through 5 of them. There are more, obviously, or not obviously, but there are definitely more, and that are working together with these 5 that I did not mention, but I will mention in this video and in the next videos that are coming up. So today I'm talking about the central banks and the big banks, which I decided to skip for episode 4 and go on to central banks, where I would just combine the banking thing together, and then later I'll go into the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the Rothschild Family and the Vatican Bank, and the European Central Bank, or any central bank for the continental unions. But in this episode, I will be explaining the next level, which is the bankers, and focusing more on central banks, and talking also about the big banks like Citi, Soros, Fund Management. I have some of them written down here. J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, among others. This is a look at how the international bankers scam you for their own political and economic purposes under the ultimate control of the Vatican's New World Order. And the Vatican is at almost the top, with the Pope being up here and Hasatan being at the very top. The United States of America is a nation that currently has an enormous amount of debt at $20 trillion and a breaking economy. And this is mostly due to the international bankers, who have been historically a very important factor in many wars, events, and depressions for their own gain. And the reason why we can't pay off our national debt is due to our banking system, which needs to be reformed. Our current system of banking was created after the National Banking Act of 1864 was signed. The United States Central Bank is deceptively called the Federal Reserve, which there are privately owned central banks in almost all nations. So it's not a Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is not owned or controlled by the government, but is instead a completely private bank run privately for the profit of the New World Order. And I'm going to go get something real quick. I completely forgot that I need this for this video, but what I'm holding in my hand is a Federal Reserve note, which is measured as $20, and on this is kind of ironic that Andrew Jackson is on the front of it, because Andrew Jackson just tried to destroy the central banking system in the United States. So it's measured as $20, but it's a Federal Reserve note. The whole point of the Federal Reserve is to gain profit for themselves and the hierarchy of the New World Order. They, like other banks, which do not have control over a nation's economy, but can severely affect it, have control over corporations, in which collude with the central banks, are responsible for funding the military-industrial complex used to create global wars to obtain more profit, and to set up corporations in different nations, and to control the government systems. The Federal Reserve has almost total control of the average people, as they determine most of the issues of money outside of the control of Congress, the Supreme Court, or the executive branch. It is the most powerful institution of the United States, yet it is not even part of the government and helps manipulate policy behind the scenes. The Federal Reserve has been, for the majority of its history, the largest creditor of the U.S. The Federal Reserve and any privately owned central bank are a problem to the nations, as they create a large national debt that results in taxes being forced upon the citizens of the nation. The issuing of money is controlled by the Federal Reserve, and that's why these are called Federal Reserve notes. You can see it up there on the top. Federal Reserve note. The U.S. government should be the issuer of the nation's money, not the privately owned Federal Reserve. We should have central banks, but not privately owned ones like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England in the UK. Both big banks like the ones in New York's financial district and central banks use a practice called fractional reserve banking, which is when more paper money is given out than there are reserves and charging a large amount of interest on loans. This practice, which is commonly used by big banks, results in widespread poverty and reduces the value of other money. The modern world's first privately owned central bank was the Bank of England, which I just mentioned, the central bank for the United Kingdom. And it is still operating today and can issue money created from nothing. Just like a corporation or a company started out with shares, the banks I put up on here, on the big bank section, are higher than the corporations, which is the lower level, because they ultimately have some or complete control over the powerful corporations, or themselves nothing but corporations, kind of just with more power and that control the money, which I guess is a resource. They're essentially private companies that can gain complete control of the nation's money supply. And as you can see higher in this hierarchy pyramid, I have the Rothschild family, which is the wealthiest family in the world. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, they're also the guardians of the Vatican treasury. And when I get to that episode, I will explain in more detail the role of the Rothschild family and other families that have worked with them in the past, such as the Warburgs, the Schiffs, the Morgans, and the Rockefellers, who were all important in the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is America's privately owned bank, as I continued to mention. Once I get to the historical portion of the series, which will come after I explain all the levels of the New World Order hierarchy, I will also get to explain a lot better, going through the history of the American Bank War in the 1830s, with Andrew Jackson killing the bank and the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The Jesuits used the Rothschilds to their advantage during the Napoleonic Wars, united with them as a plan to take back control of France after Napoleon took over. Since then, they and other banking families have established privately owned central banks in almost all world nations, and using the profit they gained for their operations of world domination. They're also just as influential as the Jesuit order and responsible for the wars and assassinations throughout history that have resulted in the deaths of millions. Abraham Lincoln, Otto von Bismarck, and Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, were all enemies of the international bankers and the Jesuits, and as a result, their nations were either plunged into war or they were assassinated, or, in the case of Abraham Lincoln, both. The solution to economic problems are the abolition of these privately owned central banks and international banking companies, which can manipulate politics and the life of an average citizen like you or me. They can manufacture depressions and create economic panics like the Panic of 1907, increase and decrease the value of money, and cause the average person to suffer in poverty, while they gain more money. But, like I said, with the big bank section on this New World Order hierarchy, this video isn't just about central banks like the Federal Reserve. It's also about the big banks whose members have gained control in politics and whose highest officials are in the secret societies of the Catholic Church I mentioned in the previous episode, and who I will continue mentioning throughout these episodes. And probably the most powerful bank is Goldman Sachs, which is right here. I drew the little logo. But there are others which have shaped the world, including JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, the Bank of New York Mellon, and Soros Fund Management, working together for a new world order. But for time's sake, I'm not going to explain all of them. I'm just going to show a couple, just enough to show my point. Goldman Sachs is both a Catholic and Jewish bank, and has many ties with world government and the Vatican Bank. Former chairmen at Goldman Sachs include Mario Draghi, current head of the European Central Bank, or former chairman and employees. As I look through here, I see that not all of them are chairman. But Mario Draghi is the current head of the European Central Bank, the central bank, which is the central bank for the European Union, which I'll talk about more in the next episode. I talk about the continental unions like European Union, the African Union, South American Union. Peter Sutherland, who was also the founding Director General of the World Trade Organization and a member of the Bilderberg Group, and a Catholic. Lucas Papademos, who is the former Prime Minister of Greece, who was put into place as a result of negotiations with the Vatican and trying to solve the Greek debt crisis. Knight of Malta Mark Carney, current governor of the Bank of England, who I talked about in the last episode when I was going through the secret societies, including the Knights of Malta. Robert Rubin, former Secretary of Treasury, former chair of Citigroup, which is another big bank, and the current chair of the Council on Foreign Relations. And current Secretary of Treasury and bonesman, or member of Skull and Bone Society, Steve Mnuchin, who was put into place by Donald Trump. I don't know if he knows or not, or because this is kind of a difficult thing. It seems that Donald Trump's against the New World Order, but many of the people in his cabinet are not. Goldman Sachs was one of the banks to receive a bailout. Many of the big banks that I'll mention in this video did as well after the financial crash and recession of 2008 and 2009, and has an important role in the European debt crisis as well, as I explained with Lucas Papademos. They have worked closely with the Vatican in order to pursue one world government, with Mario Draghi and Mario Monti working very close with the Vatican during the financial crisis. And another powerful Goldman Sachs official, and also an official at JP Morgan Chase, which is the next bank I'll talk about, is Jeffrey Boise, who was Jesuit educated at I think it was Boston College, I'm not sure, a Roman Catholic and a Knight of Malta. And he worked at JP Morgan Chase as well, and that's the next bank. The second big bank, which is also very influential, is JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest bank in the U.S. Outside the Federal Reserve, and the third largest in the world. And is named after John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan, one of the most influential men in history, and at one time the richest man in the United States. He was influential in the creation of the Federal Reserve System by creating the Panic of 1907, which I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the depressions and panics that they can manufacture. Then he stopped it, and this was used as a justification for the creation of the Federal Reserve. He was a member of the Catholic Order of St. Maurice and Lazarus, which I did not mention in the previous episode, but which is also an influential order or secret society. It's not really a secret society, but it's still an influential order. David Rockefeller, who is the founder of the Trilateral Commission, member of the CFR, or Council of Foreign Relations, and Bilderberg Group, and son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was a friend of J.P. Morgan, was the former CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is the predecessor to JP Morgan Chase, which united multiple large banks including Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual as a result of the 2008 crash. Both JP Morgan and John D. Rockefeller Jr. were members of the Jekyll Island meeting, which was a meeting of 7 different people, including the Senator Aldrich, who proposed the original Aldrich bill, and they met together to propose a plan for the Federal Reserve, the most powerful people in the world. Bank of America's CEO, Bank of America is another big bank, is Brian Moynihan, who is a Roman Catholic who was Jesuit educated at Notre Dame, who became the chairman after Merrill Lynch, which is another bank but not as big as the other ones, was absorbed by the Bank of America in, I think it was 2009, but it was saved because of its support for the Catholic Church in the past. Lehman Brothers, which is a mostly Jewish bank, was not saved. Morgan Stanley, which is another big bank that I've mentioned when I was going through the list in the beginning, CEO of Morgan Stanley is James Gorman, who is a Catholic that was Jesuit educated at Xavier University, or Xavier College, I mean. Soros Fund Management, which is a much smaller firm, was founded by George Soros, who is just as influential as many of the other people who want a new world order. He has come under the control of the New World Order and now is a very influential figure in achieving their goals, and I've talked about him a little bit on this channel before, but I want to go over the main points again. He basically, well, these are the things that you need to know about George Soros. He funded the Obama and Hillary campaign. Obama probably wouldn't have won if it wasn't for George Soros, and Hillary wouldn't have done as well as she did without George Soros. He ruined the Thai and Malaysian economies, has funded hate groups like Black Lives Matter and riots like the Ferguson riots, and even like the Ukraine Revolution and other revolutions throughout other revolutions and small uprisings and riots throughout the world, and whose goal is to create one world currency. He was the guy who was at the beginning of the last video that I showed, who was talking about China. The banks in America and around the world, and I'm only talking about national central banks and big banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, are influential in the creation of the New World Order by creating financial crises that they will profit from, wars they will profit from, and getting the money needed for their large project of one global world government, economy, and religion under the ultimate control of the anti-Mashiach, which will take place in just a few years, I believe. I will explain the bigger banks like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund of the United Nations, which is technically one world government that just hasn't completely worked out yet, in a later video. And so that is all for this video. I will see you next time. My camera's almost out of battery, so I'm just going to end this here, and there's not really anything else to talk about. Next video I will talk about the continental unions. So that is all. Goodbye.